1 week after Ethan Cole bought the old cabin beside the lake, he had only replaced the roof and cleared away months of dead weeds when 3 black sport utility vehicles came tearing up the gravel road, dust rising behind them like smoke. A woman stepped out first, dressed in a tailored coat despite the cold, followed by 2 security guards who moved like they owned the ground beneath them. She placed a thick stack of papers against his chest and said he had 24 hours to stop all work or he would regret it for the rest of his life. She expected him to fold the way every owner before him had folded, the way the town itself seemed to fold whenever her name was mentioned. What she did not know was that Ethan had spent months studying every line of the property records long before he ever signed his name on the deed, and that patience, more than fear, had always been the quality that defined him. Ethan had grown tired of the city long before he ever saw the cabin. Years of concrete, deadlines, and glass office towers had worn something out of him that he could not quite name, a slow erosion of purpose disguised as a steady paycheck. When a coworker mentioned an old property for sale near a mountain lake, something in him simply said yes before his mind had time to argue against it. The listing agent called twice to ask if he was certain, her voice carrying the particular hesitation of someone who already knew something she was not saying, something that lived just beneath the surface of every polite sentence she offered. He asked her directly if there was a problem with the property, and she paused long enough that the silence itself became an answer. Neighbors in the small town of Cedar Hollow looked at him the way people look at a stranger who has wandered into a story that ended badly for everyone before him. At the general store, an older clerk asked which house he had bought, and when Ethan mentioned the lakeside cabin, the man's expression shifted so quickly that Ethan almost asked him to explain it. The cabin itself was rough, the porch sagging under decades of rain, the windows fogged with 40 years of neglect, and ivy climbing so thick along the north wall that it had begun to pull the old boards loose. But the land around it took his breath away, wide and open toward the water, framed by maple trees just beginning to turn red with the season, the lake itself catching the morning light like something poured from glass. He signed the papers within a week, ignoring the whispered warnings, telling himself that whatever history clung to the place, it belonged to the past and not to him. He spent his first days simply walking the property, learning its slopes and its silences, before he ever picked up a hammer. When he finally started clearing the yard, pulling vines away from the old stone chimney and hauling broken branches to the burn pile, he felt something settle in his chest that the city had never given him, a kind of quiet he had almost forgotten existed. That same afternoon, as the light began to soften over the lake and long shadows stretched from the tree line, a black vehicle rolled slowly up the drive and stopped a few feet from where he stood. A woman stepped out, composed and unhurried, her presence carrying the kind of authority that expected no resistance, the kind built over years of never being questioned. She introduced herself as Margaret Sutherland, president of the Homeowners Association, and told him, without raising her voice, that he was not permitted to alter anything on the property without prior approval from her office. Ethan looked at the paint chips beneath his boots and the tools still resting against the porch rail, and he answered her plainly, saying that according to the deed in his hand, he did not need it. Margaret's expression barely changed, though something behind her eyes sharpened, the look of someone recalculating an approach that had always worked before. She told him, almost gently, that everyone who moved into Cedar Hollow eventually learned how things were done, and that it would be far easier for him to learn quickly. Ethan simply nodded, thanked her for stopping by, and returned to his work as though the conversation had already ended, leaving her standing in the gravel a moment longer than she seemed to have planned. Before Margaret's vehicle had even reached the end of the drive, an older man from the neighboring property crossed the road with a rake still in his hand, glancing back over his shoulder as though checking whether anyone had followed him. He introduced himself simply as Robert and said little else beyond a quiet warning that Margaret Sutherland did not make idle threats, that she had a way of making inconvenient people disappear from Cedar Hollow without ever raising her voice. Ethan thanked him for the concern, but told him plainly that he had read every page of the property's history before he ever placed an offer, and that he intended to trust the law over rumor. Robert studied him for a long moment, something between admiration and worry crossing his weathered face, before he nodded once, and returned to his own yard without another word. It was the first of many quiet conversations Ethan would have with neighbors, too cautious to speak openly but unwilling to stay entirely silent either. The days that followed brought a slow, deliberate pressure that Ethan had not expected from an organization meant to maintain fences and lawns. Official letters began arriving twice a week, each one printed on heavy cream paper and stamped with a seal that looked more suited to a courthouse than a residential committee. He was fined for repainting a section of the roof, fined again for removing 3 dead pine trees that leaned dangerously close to the cabin, and fined a third time simply for replacing a broken window with matching glass. Each notice cited a different section of a code book he had never been given, and each carried a deadline shorter than the last, some expiring before the letter had even reached his mailbox. He began to notice, almost by accident, a small camera mounted on a utility pole across the lake road, its lens angled directly at his property. Its presence so... One gray morning he heard a low buzzing overhead and looked up to see a drone circling above the cabin roof, hovering just long enough to photograph the new shingles before disappearing back over the tree line toward the association office. When he mentioned it to a neighbor at the general store, the older man lowered his voice and glanced toward the door before speaking, warning him gently that people who pushed back against the association rarely stayed in Cedar Hollow for long. Ethan asked what happened to them, and the man only shook his head, set down his coffee, and said it was better not to find out. That night, as Ethan sat on the porch reviewing the newest fine notice by lantern light, listening to the wind move through the maples, he heard the crunch of tires on gravel long after the sun had gone down. Two unfamiliar figures stepped out into the dark, their movements deliberate, their silence more unsettling than any shout could have been. He set the lantern down slowly, watching them approach through the thin fog rising off the lake, and understood, without needing to be told, that the warnings he had been hearing all week were finally arriving at his front door. The two men who approached him that night wore matching black jackets with a small embroidered patch that read Private Security, though neither offered a name or a badge when Ethan asked. They told him plainly that all construction on the property needed to stop immediately, and when Ethan asked under what authority, one of them simply repeated the demand louder, as though volume alone could substitute for law. He asked to see identification, or a badge number, or any document proving they represented anyone beyond themselves, and both men only stared back at him in silence. Eventually they turned and left without another word, their headlights sweeping briefly across the cabin walls before disappearing down the dark road toward town. The following morning, a delivery truck carrying lumber and roofing supplies arrived at the base of the drive, only to find one of the same black vehicles parked sideways across the narrow road, blocking any path forward. The driver called Ethan, confused and apologetic, saying he had never seen anything like it in 20 years of hauling material through these mountains. Ethan walked down to the blockade himself, boots crunching over frost still clinging to the gravel, and found the same guard from the night before, leaning against the hood of his vehicle with his arms folded. The guard told him, almost casually, that if one more board went up on that cabin, he would lose the house entirely, his tone carrying the practiced indifference of a man who had said the same words to other people before. Ethan said nothing in response, only lifted the small camera clipped to his jacket collar and made certain the guard could see the red light blinking steadily. Something flickered across the guard's expression, a brief crack in his composure, before he straightened, muttered something under his breath, and climbed back into his vehicle. The truck eventually left without unloading, promising to return once the road cleared, and Ethan spent the rest of the day quietly documenting every angle of the property, the tire tracks in the mud, the timestamp on his photographs, the exact wording of every threat he could recall while it was still fresh. That evening, exhausted but unshaken, he locked the cabin door for the first time since moving in, a small habit he had never needed in the city but suddenly felt necessary here. When he woke the next morning and stepped onto the porch with his coffee, he found the front window shattered across the floorboards, glass scattered like ice in the early light, the cold morning air pouring freely through the broken frame. He stood there for a long moment, coffee cooling in his hand, studying the pattern of the shattered glass and the single rock resting near the center of the room. Rather than call the sheriff immediately, certain that any local response would somehow trace back to the same people who had just threatened him, Ethan drove into the county seat and walked into the small records office tucked behind the courthouse. The building smelled of dust and old paper, and had clearly seen few visitors in recent years, its wooden shelves sagging under decades of forgotten files. He asked the clerk for every document related to the parcel of land along the lake, and she disappeared into the archive for nearly an hour before returning with a thin folder far older than he expected, its edges soft and yellowed with age. Inside, he found survey maps dated decades before the homeowners association had ever been formed, along with a deed history showing the cabin had existed on that land since long before any governing body claimed jurisdiction over it. A handwritten note from a previous surveyor even remarked that the parcel carried a protected access right, exempting it from certain neighborhood covenants entirely, a detail buried so deep in the file that it seemed almost forgotten by time itself. Ethan sat at a wooden table for the better part of the afternoon, cross-referencing dates and signatures, piecing together a picture no one in Cedar Hollow seemed to want him to see, the pieces fitting together with a clarity that made his pulse quicken. He copied every page twice, once for himself and once for safekeeping elsewhere, and drove straight to the office of a local attorney named Walter Bennett. a soft-spoken man with reading glasses perched low on his nose. Bennett studied the documents in silence for nearly 20 minutes before finally looking up over the rim of his glasses, his expression unreadable. He told Ethan, with the faint trace of a smile breaking through his usual composure, that if these records were accurate, the association was about to find itself in a great deal of trouble. Ethan asked how long such trouble might take to surface, and Bennett only leaned back in his chair, tapping the folder thoughtfully, saying that some truths took years to bury but only days to unearth once someone finally started digging in the right place. In the weeks that followed, the pressure on Ethan sharpened into something colder and more coordinated. The water to his cabin was shut off without warning, the utility company later claiming a routine account error that no one could quite explain despite 3 separate calls to their office. A representative from the local power cooperative arrived unannounced, hinting that his service might be delayed indefinitely due to unspecified compliance concerns tied to his property. Not long after, a county building inspector showed up at his gate, holding a clipboard full of complaints that had apparently been filed anonymously against his renovation work, complaints that referenced permits Ethan had never even been informed he needed. The inspector, a tired-looking man named Gary Holloway, walked the property with visible reluctance, glancing repeatedly toward his truck as though he would rather have been anywhere else that morning. He admitted quietly, once they were out of sight of the road, that he had received an unusual number of calls about this particular property in a short span of time, more than he typically saw in an entire year combined. Ethan asked him directly whether the complaints held any legal merit, and Holloway hesitated before answering that most of what he had been asked to investigate fell well outside his department's actual authority. He filed his report that afternoon, noting no violations of any real substance, a small victory that nonetheless did nothing to slow the flow of new complaints arriving the following week. Ethan began to understand that the goal was never truly to win any single dispute, but simply to exhaust him into surrender through sheer repetition. Rumors began circulating through town that Ethan had been clearing protected forest land near the lake, a claim that spread faster than any truth ever could in a place that small, whispered across counters and porches until it hardened into something people simply accepted as fact. Margaret herself began appearing at community gatherings that had nothing to do with property matters, mentioning Ethan's name in passing conversation with a practiced sympathy that painted him as reckless and difficult, planting seeds of doubt long before anyone had heard his side of the story. A small business owner in town, someone Ethan had never even met, quietly canceled a delivery order after hearing secondhand that the association discouraged working with him, though no explanation was ever given directly. Ethan noticed the pattern quickly, the way opposition to him never arrived as open confrontation but instead moved sideways, through favors withheld and conversations redirected, a form of pressure far harder to fight than any single threat. He resolved not to let any of it slow his work, reasoning that the cabin itself, standing whole and repaired, would eventually speak louder than any rumor Margaret chose to spread. Despite all of it, Ethan kept working, hauling water in jugs from town when necessary, and continuing to restore the cabin piece by piece under the watchful eye of the drone that still occasionally passed overhead. He learned to work early, before the fog lifted off the lake, finishing whatever he could before anyone from the association arrived to interrupt him. Slowly, some of the neighbors who once avoided his gaze began to linger a little longer at the mailbox, watching him work with something closer to curiosity than suspicion. A woman 2 properties down quietly mentioned that she too had once received strange fines for a fence she never built, though she had paid rather than fight, unwilling to risk the consequences she had seen befall others. Word of Ethan's persistence began to travel the same channels that fear once had, passed quietly between porches and driveways in a town that had learned to whisper rather than speak. For the first time, doubt about the association's authority started to take root among people who had never dared question it before, a doubt that grew a little each time Ethan's roof caught the afternoon light without consequence. It was in the middle of this shifting mood that a formal notice arrived at Ethan's cabin, summoning him to an emergency meeting of the association at the town hall, the letter carrying a tone far more urgent than any before it. He read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it beside the growing stack of documents he had already gathered, sensing that whatever was coming next would matter more than anything that had come before. The meeting room was full by the time Ethan arrived, rows of folding chairs packed with residents murmuring beneath fluorescent lights, the air thick with the particular tension of a town waiting to see who would blink first. At the front stood Margaret Sutherland, the association president, composed and immaculate as always, her presentation already glowing on a projector screen behind her. She opened with a slideshow of Ethan's cabin, zoomed photographs of the new roof, and the cleared yard displayed like evidence in a criminal trial, each image accompanied by a caption implying violation after violation. She spoke of property values, of community standards, of the danger one reckless owner posed to everyone who had worked so hard to maintain the neighborhood's image, her voice rising and falling with the practiced rhythm of someone who had delivered similar speeches many times before. She called for immediate financial penalties, for a cease and desist order backed by the county, and finally, her voice rising with practiced authority, for the seizure of the property itself under association bylaws she cited from memory without ever showing a printed copy. Ethan sat quietly through all of it, hands folded, saying nothing while the room buzzed with reactions around him, some residents nodding along out of habit, others glancing his way with quiet uncertainty. When Margaret finally paused and asked if the owner in question had anything to say for himself, a faint smile of anticipated victory already forming at the corner of her mouth, Ethan stood. He walked calmly to the front table and placed down 3 items in careful sequence, the room's murmur fading into something closer to silence with each document he laid flat against the wood. First came the original survey map showing the cabin predating the association by decades, its faded ink still legible enough to read from several rows back. Then came the county deed history confirming the land's protected status, stamped with an official seal that caught the fluorescent light. Finally, he set down the ownership certificate bearing his own name, clean and unclouded by any lien the association claimed to hold. The room fell into a silence so complete that the hum of the ceiling lights became suddenly audible, every eye shifting between the documents in Margaret's face. Margaret's attorney, seated near the front, went pale as he leaned forward to examine the papers, his earlier confidence draining visibly from his features. Margaret opened her mouth to speak, closed it again, and reached for the microphone with a hand that trembled just slightly enough for the front row to notice. For the first time since Ethan had arrived in Cedar Hollow, the balance of the room had shifted, and everyone in it seemed to feel it happen at once. A murmur rippled through the folding chairs as residents leaned toward one another, whispering questions about documents they had never known existed, records that apparently proved what many had long suspected but never dared to voice aloud. An elderly man near the back stood slowly and asked, in a voice that carried clearly across the silent room, whether the association had ever actually held legal authority over any of the lakeside properties at all. Margaret attempted to answer, her words clipped and defensive, but the explanation faltered halfway through, tangled in details that no longer matched the paperwork sitting plainly on the table before her. The meeting ended abruptly, adjourned without a formal vote, but something in the room had already changed permanently, a crack finally visible in a foundation that had once seemed unshakable. Residents filed out into the cold parking lot afterward in small clusters, talking in low, urgent voices about what they had just witnessed, several of them glancing back toward Ethan with something that looked almost like gratitude. In the days after the meeting, Ethan continued digging, driven now less by anger than by a quiet determination to understand exactly what he had stumbled into. Through further requests at the records office, he uncovered evidence that the association had been collecting mandatory fees from residents for more than 20 years, despite lacking any legal authority over several sections of the lakeside properties. He found old case files showing that at least 4 previous families had been pressured into selling their homes at prices far below market value after enduring months of manufactured fines and intimidation nearly identical to what he had experienced himself. The so-called violations cited in those files, he discovered, often referenced bylaws that had never actually been ratified by a proper vote of the community, existing only on paper Margaret herself had drafted. Margaret Sutherland's name appeared on nearly every document, sometimes as the sole signatory, always with the same confident, unquestioned authority that no one in Cedar Hollow had ever thought to challenge. Among the older files, Ethan found the story of a retired schoolteacher who had once owned a small cottage near the north end of the lake, a woman fined so relentlessly over a garden fence that she eventually sold her home for a fraction of its worth just to escape the pressure. Another file described a young family who had received nightly visits from the same security guards Ethan now recognized, visits that continued for nearly 2 months until they finally agreed to relocate outside the county entirely. A third case, the oldest of them all, involved an elderly veteran whose modest cabin had been condemned under a technicality that the county itself later quietly reversed, though by then the man had already passed away without ever reclaiming his home. Reading through each account, Ethan began to understand that his own experience was not an isolated incident, but simply the latest chapter in a pattern that had repeated itself for decades, hidden behind official letterhead and a seal that carried no real legal weight at all. Ethan spent long evenings organizing the growing pile of evidence into a timeline, connecting dates, names, and dollar amounts, until a clear pattern began to emerge from what had once looked like disconnected complaints. Word of Ethan's discoveries spread quietly among a handful of longtime residents, several of whom agreed, cautiously at first, to speak on record about their own experiences with the association's tactics. One evening, as Ethan reviewed his growing collection of files by lamplight, the lake outside gone black and still beneath a clouded sky, a knock came at the cabin door, softer and more hesitant than any visit he had received before. Standing on the porch was an older man who introduced himself as Harold Whitmore, a former board member of the very association that had been tormenting Ethan for weeks. Ethan invited him inside without hesitation, sensing immediately that this visit carried none of the menace the others had. Harold sat at Ethan's kitchen table and unpacked a worn leather satchel filled with old emails, printed board meeting minutes, and a handful of documents he described as evidence he had kept hidden for years out of fear of what Margaret might do if she ever discovered he had taken them. The emails revealed conversations between Margaret and two other board members discussing how to pressure certain homeowners into selling without ever mentioning the true legal status of their land. One message in particular showed Margaret instructing a colleague to fabricate a violation report against a resident who had refused to attend a private meeting about a development proposal, the language cold and calculated in a way that surprised even Ethan. Harold explained that Margaret had known for years the cabin, along with several other lakeside parcels, fell outside the association's jurisdiction entirely, yet she continued issuing fines and threats regardless, treating the law as an inconvenience rather than a boundary. Beneath all of it lay a simple, financial motive that Harold had only recently pieced together himself after years of quiet suspicion. A group of wealthy investors, he explained, had been quietly attempting to acquire the entire lakefront section of Cedar Hollow for years, hoping to build a private resort development once enough of the original homeowners could be driven out through pressure rather than negotiation. Margaret, it turned out, stood to receive a significant commission for every property she helped clear from the association's path, a fact confirmed by one particular email referencing a payment schedule tied directly to closed sales. Ethan listened in silence as the full shape of the scheme came into focus. The fines, the drones, the security guards, all of it suddenly making a colder kind of sense than he had allowed himself to imagine. Harold apologized for staying silent for so long, his voice heavy with regret, and Ethan told him plainly that it was never too late to make things right. Within days, a reporter from the regional newspaper, having caught wind of rising tension in Cedar Hollow, arrived at Ethan's cabin asking to hear his story in full. The article ran on a quiet Thursday morning, detailing the discrepancies in the association's legal authority, alongside excerpts from Harold's documents and photographs of the fines Ethan had received for simple home repairs. By that evening, phones across Cedar Hollow were ringing with neighbors, comparing notes they had never dared share aloud before, stories that had sat quietly for years, suddenly finding their way into open conversation. The reporter, a woman named Susan Marlowe who had covered small-town politics for nearly 15 years, told Ethan privately that she had never seen a community shift its opinion so quickly once real documentation finally entered the conversation. She followed up with a second article days later, this one including brief statements from 3 former residents who had once been pressured into selling their homes, each describing eerily similar patterns of fines, drones, and unmarked vehicles appearing at their properties. The county clerk's office reported a sudden surge in requests for old property records, ordinary residents finally curious enough to check whether their own homes carried the same protections Ethan's cabin did. Even people who had never spoken to Ethan directly began referring to him around town by name, no longer as the strange outsider who had bought the cursed cabin, but as the man who had finally exposed something everyone had quietly suspected for years. The following community meeting, originally scheduled as another routine session, filled far beyond capacity, spilling residents out into the hallway of the town hall and down the front steps into the cold evening air. Margaret attempted to open the meeting with her usual composure, adjusting the microphone with practiced ease, but the questions came faster than she could deflect them, sharp and specific, citing dates and dollar amounts from records she had never expected anyone to find. Her attorney, visibly uncomfortable, requested a private recess that the crowd refused to grant, several residents standing to demand answers about fees paid over decades with no accounting of where the money had gone. Margaret's voice, usually so measured, began to fracture under the weight of the room's collective anger, her explanations growing shorter and less convincing with every question thrown from the crowd. One by one, the security guards who had once intimidated Ethan on his own property quietly slipped out through the side doors, unwilling to be associated with what was unfolding in front of an audience that no longer feared them. Residents called loudly for her immediate removal from the board, for an independent audit of every account the association had ever held, and for reimbursement of fines that had never carried any legal weight to begin with. A woman near the back, her voice shaking but firm, stood and read aloud the exact amount she had paid in unjust fines over 11 years, the number alone drawing a wave of gasps across the room. By the end of the evening, a formal vote was called, and Margaret Sutherland watched as hand after hand rose against her, the very community she had ruled for years, choosing, almost unanimously, to remove her from power. She left the town hall alone, her black vehicle pulling away into the dark without the security escort that had once made her presence feel untouchable, the taillights fading quickly around the bend toward the lake road. Ethan stayed a while longer, answering quiet questions from neighbors, who thanked him for something he had never intended to become, an accidental symbol of resistance in a town too afraid to speak until someone finally did. Harold shook his hand near the door, his eyes damp with something between relief and gratitude, and told him that Cedar Hollow owed him more than it could ever properly repay. When Ethan finally drove back along the lake road, the night had turned clear and cold, stars scattered thickly above the water, the whole valley wrapped in a stillness that felt different from any he had known before. He parked in front of the cabin, sat for a long moment in the stillness, and felt, for the first time since arriving in Cedar Hollow, something close to peace settle over the property. The following weeks brought a slow unraveling of everything Margaret had built, an independent audit confirming exactly what Harold's documents had already revealed, and a formal county investigation opening into decades of collected fees that had never been properly accounted for. Several of the wealthy residents who had once stood firmly behind Margaret at every meeting grew quiet in the weeks that followed, their names appearing only briefly in the audit before they distanced themselves entirely from any further involvement with the board. The investors behind the resort proposal withdrew their interest almost immediately once the story spread beyond Cedar Hollow, unwilling to attach their names to a plan built on years of documented intimidation. Ethan was asked more than once whether he intended to file a lawsuit against Margaret personally, and each time he considered it carefully before deciding that restoring what had been taken mattered more to him than punishing the woman who had taken it. The county eventually pursued its own case against her separately, a matter Ethan chose to watch unfold from a respectful distance rather than involve himself further. Months later, the cabin stood transformed, its new cedar roof catching the afternoon light, a wide porch stretching along the front where the old sagging boards had once been. Wildflowers grew freely across what had been a tangle of dead weeds, purple and gold blossoms swaying gently in the breeze that rolled off the water each evening. A small wooden dock now reached out into the calm water of the lake, sturdy enough to hold a chair and a fishing line on quiet evenings, the boards still smelling faintly of fresh-cut cedar. At night, warm lamplight spilled from the windows and reflected in long golden ribbons across the surface of the lake, visible from nearly every property along the shoreline, a quiet beacon where there had once been only darkness and fear. Neighbors who had once crossed the road to avoid speaking with Ethan now stopped by on weekends, some bringing tools to help finish small projects, others simply bringing coffee and conversation that lasted long into the afternoon. Harold visited often, sitting on the new porch with a cup of tea, sometimes reminiscing about the town he remembered before Margaret's influence had spread so far into every corner of daily life. The association itself had been restructured under new leadership, its bylaws rewritten and reviewed by an independent committee that finally gave residents a real voice in decisions that affected their homes. Margaret Sutherland was never seen in Cedar Hollow again, her name mentioned only occasionally, usually followed by a slow shake of the head and a story someone else had not yet heard. One afternoon, an older woman who had lived in Cedar Hollow for nearly 30 years stood at the edge of Ethan's new porch and told him quietly that if he had given up that first day, they all would have remained under the same quiet control for years to come. Ethan looked out over the water, the maples along the ridge now bare with the turning season, their red leaves long since scattered across the lawns and the surface of the lake. He answered that he had not bought the cabin simply for the view, though the view alone would have been reason enough for most people. He told her he had bought it because no one should ever be allowed to use property, or fear, or manufactured authority as a weapon against people who had every right to what was rightfully theirs. The camera pulled slowly back from the cabin, its windows glowing warm against the deepening blue of early evening, the reflection trembling gently across the still surface of the lake. The peace that finally settled over Cedar Hollow had not come from defeating one woman or dismantling one corrupt board, but from restoring something far older and far simpler, the basic right of a person to hold what was rightfully theirs without threat or interference. Ethan sat on the porch as the sun dipped behind the tree line, a cup of coffee warming his hands, watching the last light scatter gold across the water in slow, widening ripples. Somewhere across the lake, a loon called once into the stillness, and the sound carried clean and unbroken over water that finally belonged, in every sense that mattered, to the people who had always deserved it. Ahead of him lay a new chapter, quiet and unclaimed, in a place where no one could ever again mistake borrowed authority for real power. The cabin that had once been called cursed by frightened neighbors now stood as proof of something else entirely, that patience and truth, given enough time, could outlast even the most carefully built illusion of control. Ethan finished his coffee slowly, listening to the wind move through the maples one last time before the season turned fully toward winter, and understood that this quiet moment on the porch was the only reward he had ever truly wanted from the fight. Word of what had happened in Cedar Hollow eventually reached neighboring towns along the mountain corridor, where a handful of residents facing similar disputes with their own associations reached out to Ethan directly, asking how he had managed to uncover records that others had never thought to search for. He answered each of them the same way, telling them that the truth rarely announced itself loudly, that it waited quietly in dusty folders and forgotten filing cabinets for someone patient enough to go looking. Walter Bennett, the attorney who had first confirmed the strength of Ethan's case, began fielding calls from families in 3 surrounding counties, several of whom later succeeded in overturning fines and reclaiming properties using the same methods Ethan had pioneered almost by accident. What began as one man's quiet refusal to be intimidated slowly became something larger, a reminder spreading through the mountains that authority without foundation could not survive honest scrutiny for long. By the time winter fully settled over Cedar Hollow, snow dusting the maple branches and softening the edges of the lake beneath a thin sheet of ice, Ethan had grown accustomed to a rhythm of life he once thought belonged only to memory. He split firewood in the mornings, read by the fire in the evenings, and watched the light change over the water with the kind of attention he had never allowed himself back in the city. Harold stopped by less often as the cold deepened, though he always called ahead, and their conversations had settled into an easy familiarity built on everything they had endured together that autumn. Ethan sometimes stood at the window in the quiet hours before dawn, watching frost gather along the glass, and thought about how close he had come to walking away entirely during those first difficult weeks. He never regretted staying. Whatever the cabin had cost him in sleep, in stress, in the slow accumulation of fear that had followed him those early nights, it had given back tenfold in the certainty that some things were worth defending simply because they were right. The lake outside his window, frozen and silent under the winter sky, no longer felt like a place haunted by old warnings and whispered names. It felt, finally and completely, like home. Spring eventually returned to Cedar Hollow, melting the ice from the lake and coaxing new greenness through the soil where the wildflowers had slept through winter. Ethan stood on the dock one clear morning, watching the water settle into stillness after months of frozen silence, and realized how much the property had changed since that first afternoon when 3 black vehicles had come tearing up the gravel road. The cabin no longer felt like a battleground or a test of endurance, but simply like a home, weathered and honest, standing exactly where it always should have stood, undisturbed by anyone claiming authority they never truly held. He thought often, in those quiet spring mornings, about how easily the entire story might have ended differently had he not taken the time to read every page of the property's history before signing his name, had he simply believed the warnings and walked away like so many owners before him. It was not courage alone that had carried him through the fines, the threats, and the long nights spent poring over dusty records, but a stubborn insistence on the plain and simple truth. Cedar Hollow, in the end, had not needed a hero so much as it had needed one person willing to ask questions that everyone else had long since stopped asking, and to keep asking them until the answers finally came.